The ruling class. Elementi di Scienza Politica. Gaetano Mosca. Translation by Hannah D. Kahn. Edited and revised, with an introduction, by Arthur Livingston. 1896. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 6. Suffrage and Social Forces. 1. Many doctrines that advocate liberty and equality, as the latter terms are still commonly understood, doctrines which the 18th century thought out, which the 19th perfected and tried to apply and which the 20th will probably dispense with or modify substantially, are summed up and given concrete form in the theory that views universal suffrage as the foundation of all sound government. It is commonly believed that the only free, equitable and legitimate government is a government that is based upon the will of the majority by its vote delegating its powers for a specified length of time to men who represent it. Down to a few generations ago, and even today in the eyes of many writers and statesmen, all flaws in representative government were attributed to incomplete or mistaken applications of the principles of representation and suffrage. Louis Blanc, Lamartine and indeed all the democratic writers in France before 1848 ascribed the alleged corruption of the July monarchy and all the drawbacks of the French parliamentary system to interference by the monarch with the elective bodies and, especially, to limited suffrage. Similar beliefs were widely current in Italy down to 30 years ago. For instance, they formed, as they still form, the groundwork of the Mazzinian school. A following so large, beliefs so widespread, are not to be discredited in a page or two. We shall not, therefore, attempt a systematic refutation of the theories on which universal suffrage is based. We shall simply refer to some of the main considerations that most seriously undermine the foundations on which universal suffrage as an intellectual edifice rests. We deem it sufficient for our purposes here to demonstrate that the assumption that the elected official is the mouthpiece of the majority of his electors is as a rule not consistent with the facts, and we believe that this can be proved by facts of ordinary experience and by certain practical observations that anyone can make on the manner in which elections are conducted. What happens in other forms of government, namely, that an organized minority imposes its will on the disorganized majority, happens also into perfection, whatever the appearances to the contrary, under the representative system. When we say that the voters choose their representative, we are using a language that is very inexact. The truth is that the representative has himself elected by the voters, and, if that phrase should seem too inflexible and too harsh to fit some cases, we might qualify it by saying that his friends have him elected. In elections, as in all other manifestations of social life, those who have the will and, especially, the moral, intellectual and material means to force their will upon others take the lead over the others and command them. The political mandate has been likened to the power of attorney that is familiar in private law. But in private relationships, delegations of powers and capacities always presuppose that the principal has the broadest freedom in choosing his representative. Now in practice, in popular elections, that freedom of choice, though complete theoretically, necessarily becomes null, not to say ludicrous. If each voter gave his vote to the candidate of his heart, we may be sure that in almost all cases the only result would be a wide scattering of votes. When very many wills are involved, choice is determined by the most various criteria, almost all of them subjective, and if such wills were not coordinated and organized, it would be virtually impossible for them to coincide in the spontaneous choice of one individual. If his vote is to have any efficacy at all, therefore, each voter is forced to limit his choice to a very narrow field, in other words to a choice among the 2 or 3 persons who have some chance of succeeding, and the only ones who have any chance of succeeding are those whose candidacies are championed by groups, by committees, by organized minorities. In order to simplify the situation for purposes of proof, we have assumed a uninominal ballot, where one name only is to be voted for. But the great majority of voters will necessarily have a very limited freedom in the choice of their representative, and the influence of committees will necessarily be preponderant, whatever the system of balloting. When the list ballot is used and the voter votes for a list of candidates, it turns out that the number of candidates with some chance of succeeding is less than double the number of representatives to be elected. How do these organized minorities form about individual candidates or groups of candidates? As a rule, they are based on considerations of property and taxation, on common material interests, on ties of family, class, religion, sect or political party. Whether their component personnels be good or bad, there can be no doubt that such committees, and the representatives who are now their tools, now their leaders or bosses, represent the organization of a considerable number of social values and forces. In practice, therefore, the representative system results not at all in government by the majority, it results in the participation of a certain number of social values in the guidance of the state, in the fact that many political forces which in an absolute state, a state ruled by a bureaucracy alone, would remain inert and without influence upon government become organized and so exert an influence on government. 2. In examining the relations between the representative system and juridical defense, a number of distinctions and observations have to be borne in mind. The great majority of voters are passive, it is true, in the sense that they have not so much freedom to choose their representatives as a limited right to exercise an option among a number of candidates. Nevertheless, limited as it may be, that capacity has the effect of obliging candidates to try to win a weight of votes that will serve to tip the scales in their direction, so that they make every effort to flatter, wheedle and obtain the goodwill of the voters. In this way certain sentiments and passions of the common herd come to have their influence on the mental attitudes of the representatives themselves, and echoes of a widely disseminated opinion, or of any serious discontent, easily come to be heard in the highest spheres of government. It may be objected that this influence of the majority of voters is necessarily confined to the broad lines of political policy and makes itself felt only on a very few topics of a very general character, and that within limits as narrow as that even in absolute governments the ruling classes are obliged to take account of mass sentiments. In fact, the most despotic of governments has to proceed very cautiously when it comes to shocking the sentiments, convictions or prejudices of the majority of the governed, or to requiring of that majority pecuniary sacrifices to which they are not accustomed. But wariness about giving offense will be much greater when every single representative, whose vote may be useful or necessary to the executive branch of government, knows that the discontent of the masses may at almost any moment bring about the triumph of a rival. We are aware that this is a two-edged argument. The masses are not always any wiser in discerning and protecting their interests than their representatives are, and we are acquainted with regions where public discontent has created greater obstacles to desirable reforms than the mistakes of parliamentary representatives and ministries. The representative system, furthermore, has widely different effects according as the molecular composition of the electoral body varies. If all the voters who have some influence, because of education or social position, are members of one or another of the organized minorities, and if only a mass of poor and ignorant citizens are left outside of them, it is impossible for the latter to exercise their right of option and control in any real or effective manner. In these circumstances, of the various organized minorities that are disputing the field, that one infallibly wins which spends most money or lies most persuasively. The same thing happens if persons of ability and economic independence represent only a slender minority within the electing group and so have no way of influencing the vote of majorities directly. Then, as ordinarily happens in large cities, the majorities do not feel the moral and material influence of the better elements. But when the better elements do succeed in withdrawing the majority from the influence of committees and ward heelers and win its vote, their control over the conduct of the organized minorities becomes effective. It follows, therefore, that the comparison of the merits and platforms of the various candidates will be relatively serious and dispassionate only when electoral forces are not entirely under the control of men who make a regular profession or trade of electioneering. The real juridical safeguard in representative governments lies in the public discussion that takes place within representative assemblies. Into those assemblies the most disparate political forces and elements make their way, and the existence of a small independent minority is often enough to control the conduct of a large majority and, especially, to prevent the bureaucratic organization from becoming omnipotent. But when, beyond being organs of discussion and publicizing, assemblies come to concentrate all the prestige and power of legitimate authority in their own hands, as regularly happens in parliamentary governments, then in spite of the curb of public discussion the whole administrative and judiciary machine falls prey to the irresponsible and anonymous tyranny of those who win in the elections and speak in the name of the people, and we get one of the worst types of political organization that the real majority in a modern society can possibly be called upon to tolerate. In governments that are based very largely on the representative principle, the referendum is in some respects a fairly effective instrument. By it the mass of likes and dislikes, enthusiasms and angers, which, when they are truly widespread and truly general, constitute what may quite plausibly be called public opinion, is enabled to react against the conduct and enterprise of the governing minority. In a referendum it is a question not of making a choice, or an election, but of pronouncing a yes or a no upon a specific question. No single vote, therefore, is lost, and each single vote has its practical importance independently of any coordination or organization along lines of sect, party or committee. However, the democratic ideal of majority government is not realized even by the referendum. Governing is not altogether a matter of allowing or prohibiting modifications in constitutions or laws. It is quite as much a matter of managing the whole military, financial, judiciary and administrative machine, or of influencing those who manage it. Then again, even if the referendum does serve to limit the arbitrariness of the governing class, it is no less true that often it seriously hampers improvements in the political organism. Such improvements will always be more readily appreciated by a governing class, however selfish and corrupt it may be, than by the ill-informed majority of the governed. In many countries, for instance, if increases in taxes were to be submitted to referendum, they would always be rejected, even though they were of the most unqualified urgency and would be of the most obvious benefit to the public. 3. A question that is vigorously debated among writers on the social sciences is the extent to which the state should interfere in the various departments of social life, and more specifically in business. This problem involves, really, not one question but a group of questions, and we hope that by applying the theories that have been set forth in previous chapters we can help to dispel certain ambiguities and misconceptions which have so far hampered a clear and sound understanding of those questions, and prevented, in certain cases at least, the reaching of satisfactory conclusions. Still very widespread is the feeling that society and the state are two separate and distinct entities, and people often go so far as to consider them antagonistic. Now it is necessary, first of all, to decide very clearly what is meant by society and what is meant by state. If we keep to legal codes and concepts of administrative law, the state is certainly a distinct entity which is capable of existing in a legal sense and which represents the interests of the group as a whole and administers the public domain. As such an entity, the state has interests, and its interests may come into conflict with the interests of private individuals and with the interests of other juridical entities. Politically speaking, however, the state is nothing more than the organization of all social forces that have a political significance. In other words, it is the sum total of all the elements in a society that are suited to exercising political functions and have the ability and the will to participate in them. In that sense, the state is the resultant of the coordination and disciplining of those elements. That is the point of view from which the state should be looked upon by students of the social sciences. The legalistic tendency to consider political problems purely and exclusively from the standpoint not so much of law as of court practice involves an ugly and a dangerous error, which still persists in our age though it has all along hampered an adequate understanding of such problems. From our point of view there can be no antagonism between state and society. The state is to be looked upon merely as that part of society which performs the political function. Considered in this light, all questions touching interference or non-interference by the state come to assume a new aspect. Instead of asking what the limits of state activity ought to be, we try to find out what the best type of political organization is, which type, in other words, enables all the elements that have a political significance in a given society to be best utilized and specialized, best subjected to reciprocal control and to the principle of individual responsibility for the things that are done in the respective domains. When people contrast state management with private initiative, they are often merely comparing work done by a bureaucracy with work that might be done by other directing elements in society. The latter may, in fact, in some cases actually have an official status without necessarily being paid employees. In societies of our European type, however extensively bureaucratized they may be, the bureaucracy is not the state but only a part of it. When, therefore, it is said, as people commonly say, that in Italy, France or Germany the state does everything and absorbs everything, the dictum has to be taken in the sense that the French, Italian or German bureaucracies have many more functions than the bureaucracies of other countries, of England or the United States, let us say. In the same way, when we speak of the famous English self-government, when we say that the English people governs itself, we must not imagine, as we might be tempted to do if we kept to the literal meaning of the phrase, that on the continent the French, the Italians, the Germans do not govern themselves but entrust the management of their respective political and administrative institutions to others. We must understand simply that in England certain posts are entrusted to persons who are elected by popular vote or are even appointed by the government but who in any event are chosen from among the prominent people of the various districts, who are not paid for their services and who are not transferable at will, whereas the same posts are filled in other countries in Europe by salaried employees. 4. As we have seen, Chapter 3, Section 8, state bureaucracies and the assemblies that wield supreme political power have participated and still participate, in one country or another, in the management of certain branches of economic activity, for example in banking or in the construction and maintenance of public works, but management of economic production has never been completely bureaucratized in any society that has attained even a moderately high level of prosperity and civilization. In that branch of activity management has been and still is on the whole entrusted to elements who do, to be sure, form a part of the ruling forces of society and so are real political forces, but who do not appear on the payrolls of public administration. In general, the intervention in economic enterprise of elements that exercise strictly political, in other words legislative, administrative, or judiciary, control over society, has been harmful, and a large share in the pauperization that is afflicting a number of modern countries must be ascribed to that interference. In general, those who insist on limiting the activities of the state should take as their guide the very simple and very practical principle that in every branch of social activity, in education, religion, poor relief, military organization, or the administration of justice, management is always necessary, and that managerial functions have to be entrusted to a special class that has the abilities required for performing them. Now, when one sets out to withdraw one of the above-mentioned functions in whole or in part from bureaucratic management, or from control by elective bodies, it must be borne in mind that there has to be present within the society a class of persons who possess the capacities, in other words have the moral and intellectual training and, let us not forget, the economic resources required for performing the new task which is to be turned over to them. It is not enough, oftentimes, that a society contain elements that are suitable for the given purpose. These elements have to be well chosen and well coordinated, otherwise the experiment may fail or result in positive harm. We suspect, for instance, that has been the real reason why the jury system has not worked so very well in many countries in continental Europe. Jurors, or lay judges as they have been called, represent the intervention in the administration of the penal law of social elements that are foreign to the regular magistracy. But jury panels are far too inclusive for all jurymen to be intellectually and morally equal to their tasks. Furthermore, too little distinction goes to the office of juror to bring jurymen such gratification of personal pride as to make them acquire that public spirit, that aristocratic sense, as we have called it, which is necessary to raise above the average the characters of the men to whom such delicate duties are entrusted. The same might be said of justices of the peace, citizen arbitrators and referees, charity and relief commissioners and, as regards Italy in particular, the holders of certain other offices that are entrusted to persons who are not members of the bureaucracy. It might be objected, of course, that the choices of incumbents for the offices in question are often made, more or less directly, by local elective bodies. On the other hand, those who favor broader activities on the part of the state ought to consider the practical and positive significance of the term state, stripping it of everything about it that in common parlance is vague, indeterminate or, we might almost say, magical and supernatural. Often in our day state ownership or control is invoked as a remedy for all the evils of private competition, for greed, for the passion for power, for the excesses of individualism or, more exactly, of selfishness. The state, it is said, is the organ of righteousness and moral progress. It ought to exalt the humble and abase the proud. Free of all vulgar preoccupations of personal interest, it ought to suppress all iniquities, provide for all material and moral needs and set mankind on the flowery pathways of justice, peace and universal harmony. How much of its confidence this soaring trust would lose if, instead of thinking of the state as an abstract entity, as something foreign to the real world, one were to bear clearly in mind that in reality the state is just the concrete organization of a large number of the elements that rule in a given society, that when we speak of the state's influence we mean the influence that is to be exerted by government officials and government clerks. They are all very fine fellows, to be sure, but however much they may have been improved or chastened by their sense of responsibility, by discipline or pride of office, they nevertheless possess all human capacities and all human frailties. Like all men, they have eyes they can open or shut at will and mouths that can on occasion speak, be silent or even eat. They too can sin through pride, sloth, cupidity and vanity. They too have their sympathies and antipathies, their friendships and aversions, their passions and interests, and among their interests an interest in keeping their jobs or even in slipping into better ones if the occasion offers.